long before the pyramids rose above the sands, long before the name Egypt was ever spoken, there was only the river, the wind, the stars, and the people who moved like shadows along the edge of time. In the deep silence of what we now call the Nile Valley, thousands of years before kings ruled and temples rose, life was simple, slow, and full of quiet wonder. Each morning began with the golden shimmer of sunlight on the water. The Nile, dark and wide, curled like a living serpent through the land, bringing with it silt, life, and stories. Its floodwaters carved the rhythm of time, rising, falling, nourishing everything they touched. Villages grew like tiny seeds along its banks. Mud brick homes baked in the sun, surrounded by date palms, narrow footpaths, and laughter. Chickens bepecked the ground, goats bleated lazily, smoke from morning fires curled into the air. Fishermen slipped into the river in silence, their reed canoes parting the water like blades through silk. Nets cast wide, hands calloused from years of work. In the distance, herons watched silently from the reeds, still as statues. In the fields, women bent low, sowing barley and emmer wheat with practiced grace. The earth here was unlike anywhere else, dark, moist, and fertile, brought alive by the river's gift. Children ran barefoot along the riverbank, their laughter light and unburdened, chasing dragonflies and tossing stones. But this was not yet a kingdom. There were no crowns here, no pharaohs, no pyramids, only people living, breathing, watching the stars. They lived in the two lands, what we now call Upper and Lower Egypt. In the south, steep cliffs and narrow valleys. In the north, wide marshes and open skies. Two different worlds, yet bound together by one river. Each village had its own traditions, its own gods. In one, they worshipped a falcon that soared across the sky. In another, a serpent that slithered through the underworld. In some, the crocodile was sacred, powerful, feared, and respected. At night, the people gathered by the fire, the sound of crackling wood, the smell of roasted grain, and sweet palm wine. Elders spoke slowly, telling stories passed down from voices now long gone. They spoke of the sun god Ra, who sailed his golden boat across the sky each day and disappeared into the underworld each night. They spoke of the sky goddess Nut, whose body arched over the world, her skin sparkling with stars. And they spoke of the spirits in the river, silent watchers who could bless or curse with the rising of the flood. The people watched the stars not just for beauty, but for meaning. They read the heavens like a book, marking the coming of seasons, the time to plant, the time to harvest, the time to wait. Their world moved not in minutes or hours, but in moons and floods. When someone died, they were not simply buried. Death was a journey, a passage. Bodies were placed gently in shallow graves, curled like infants, wrapped in mats or linen. With them went food, tools, beads, and the things they might need in the next world: bread, beer, a flint knife, a carved amulet, a song whispered one last time, and slowly, across generations, something began to stir. In the southern valleys, where the cliffs rose high and the river narrowed, a figure emerged. His name has been lost, erased by time, or never carved at all. But the people remembered his presence, his way of speaking, his ability to bring peace where there was once division. He wore the white crown of the South, tall, slender, a symbol of power. But he ruled not with fear, but with vision. He gathered the tribes not through war, but through agreement, unity, hope. With his rise came new signs, symbols painted and carved, carried on banners, worn on pendants. The falcon god Horus began to appear more often, standing above others, wings outstretched. Perhaps it was this leader who first declared that kings were chosen not by men, but by the gods. People began to look beyond their village, beyond their fields and fires. They began to dream. They dreamed of walls that would stand forever, of names that would echo after death, of a land not divided by riverbanks, but united under one rule, one purpose, one destiny. And the symbols grew stronger. Marks etched into ivory, scratched into pottery, pressed into wet clay. The first signs of writing, not yet full words, but hints of a language to come. The early heartbeat of what would become a civilization, unlike any the world had seen. The river still rose, the stars still turned, but something in the air had changed. And so the whispers began. A leader, a ruler, a king, but not yet. A pharaoh, not yet. This is where our story begins, not in battle or glory or stone, but in silence, in the hush before history found its voice, in the sacred stillness of the Nile, where dreams began to take shape, and where the crown was still only an idea, waiting to be born. The river never stopped moving. As the years turned to centuries, the people of the Nile watched the same gentle cycles play out, flood and retreat, planting and harvest, birth and death. But something deep beneath those rhythms had shifted. A new kind of leader had emerged, not just a village chief or a wise elder, but someone with symbols, structure, and a vision for more. The land had begun to speak in unison, and soon the name of a man echoed louder than the rest. Narmer. No one knows if he was born a ruler or rose through wisdom and strength, but legends say he was tall, commanding, with eyes like flint and a voice like the river at night. He wore the white crown of Upper Egypt, the land of cliffs and sharp stone, but his eyes turned northward to the sprawling, fertile delta, where the marshes shimmered like mirrors under the sun. Lower Egypt. It was there, in the lush lands of the north, that the two lands would become one. In Narmer's time, there were still many local kings, lords of individual towns or regions. Each had their banners, their animals, their totems, the cobra goddess for some, the bee for others. It was a world of shifting alliances, quiet rivalries, and occasional raids. But Narmer saw further. He knew that true power did not lie in conquest alone, but in symbolism, in stories, in order. He moved slowly, deliberately, sending messages on clay tablets carved in early symbols, building relationships, demanding tribute not in blood, but in loyalty. And when resistance came, as it always did, he met it with precision. One by one, the cities of Lower Egypt either joined him or fell to him. And in time, the two crowns became one, white for Upper Egypt, red for Lower Egypt, worn together as a sign of unification. Power over both lands, a divine right. And so, the first dynasty began. They say Narmer was not just a warrior, but a priest and a judge, a man of rituals and law. He oversaw ceremonies where sacred animals were honored, where the gods were invoked not just in voice, but in act. He built shrines along the riverbanks, small at first, humble, made of reeds and clay, but they were symbols of permanence. Stone would come later. His court gathered scribes, artists, craftsmen. They began recording events, the first historical scenes, not just drawings of gods or beasts, but of real battles, real kings, real victories. The famous Narmer palette was carved, a flat stone decorated with symbols and scenes. Narmer wearing both crowns, standing over defeated enemies, watched by falcons and divine emblems. It was not just a record, it was a message. The king was no longer just a man. He was chosen. He was sacred. He stood between the gods and the people. With unification came more than territory. It brought administration, roads, and storage houses, scribes to count the grain, officials to measure land, messengers to carry laws. The people felt the change. Where once there had been scattered fields and tribal laws, there was now structure. A rhythm not only in nature, but in society. People began to build larger homes. Pottery became more refined. Tombs became deeper, with more offerings, not just for farmers or chieftains, but for those who served the king. Even the way people spoke began to shift. A standard dialect slowly emerged, a shared script, a shared name for the land, Kemet, the Black Land, named for the dark, fertile soil left behind by the Nile's flood. Narmer ruled for many years, though no one knows how many. When he died, his tomb was placed in Abydos, a sacred city of the dead. His body laid to rest with care, not yet a pyramid, but a chambered tomb dug into the desert floor, lined with wood and stone, surrounded by offerings, servants, carved ivory, and ceremonial objects. And beside him, the seeds of a dynasty. His son would rule after him, and his son's son. And so it would continue, dynasty after dynasty, century after century, all the way to the age of the Great Pyramids and beyond. But it began here, with Narmer, with a crown made from two, with a vision that stretched not just across the land, but across time itself. Tonight, as the fire crackles softly and your breath slows to match the river's flow, remember the man who united a world. Not with thunder, but with symbols. Not with rage, but with rhythm. Not with fear, but with a dream of a land that would one day be called eternal. Sleep now. The Nile flows on, and history continues its gentle march through time. The Nile flowed as it always had, patient and eternal, but the world around it was changing. In the generations after Narmer, Egypt was no longer just a scattering of villages and tribes. It was a kingdom, unified, crowned, and watched over by men who were no longer seen as men alone. They were pharaohs now, living gods, bridges between heaven and earth, chosen not just to rule, but to maintain balance, to uphold Ma'at, the divine order that kept the stars in place, the river flowing, and the world from falling into chaos. The early pharaohs walked softly through this new world of power. Their palaces were still humble by future standards, their cities simple clusters of homes and granaries. But their presence cast long shadows. Their names were spoken with reverence, and their rituals shaped the future. The gods, once local and varied, began to take on national meaning. Horus, once a sky god of the south, became the symbol of kingship itself. The pharaoh was Horus in life, and upon death he became Osiris, the god of the underworld and eternal renewal. New temples rose from the earth, small but sacred, not yet the stone giants of later centuries, but early sanctuaries made of wood and reeds, painted in red ochre and lined with offerings, dates, beer, incense, and flowers. Priests began to hold greater power. They memorized prayers, conducted rituals, and studied the movement of stars. The pharaoh relied on them to speak to the gods, and in turn, they taught the people how to honor the divine through ceremony. The calendar was born. Linked to the flooding of the Nile, it told farmers when to plant and harvest, and guided priests in choosing the sacred days. 3 seasons: flood, growth, and harvest, each with its purpose, each a reflection of Ma'at. Time itself was becoming sacred. Art flourished, no longer just decorative, but symbolic. Paintings and carvings told stories of creation, of battles fought in heaven, of gods who wept and bled for humankind. Symbols became standardized: the Ankh for life, the Jed for stability, the Eye of Horus for protection. The pharaoh's name was written inside a cartouche, an oval shape symbolizing eternity. His titles grew longer: Lord of the Two Lands, High Priest of every temple, he who keeps Ma'at. But even in this growing web of ritual and rule, daily life continued quietly for most. Farmers still woke before the sun. Women still wove linen and baked bread. Children played in the dust, laughing as they chased one another between the reeds. The greatness of Egypt did not lie only in its kings, but in its people, those who built, who harvested, who prayed, and who dreamed. Tombs became more elaborate: mud brick mastabas, bench-shaped graves, lined with painted scenes of daily life, fishing, feasting, music, and games. These were not just memorials, they were portals. The dead were not gone. They had simply moved to another realm. And with the right offerings, the right rituals, they could live again. The journey through the afterlife was imagined in rich detail: fields of reeds, rivers of stars, trials and gates, and gods with the heads of beasts. And at the heart of it all, the weighing of the heart. Each soul would stand before Osiris, their heart placed on one side of a scale, a feather of Ma'at on the other. If the heart was light, they would pass into eternal peace. If not, they would be devoured by Ammit, the soul eater. So people lived carefully, with honor and humility, not from fear, but from faith. Every act of kindness, every word of truth, a step closer to eternity. As the early dynasties unfolded, new cities rose along the Nile. Memphis, near the border of Upper and Lower Egypt, became a thriving center of trade, worship, and law. The court moved there. Roads were built. Boats carried goods up and down the river: golds, linen, papyrus, cattle, copper. Scribes became essential. They learned to write in hieroglyphs, not just pictures, but a full language of sound and meaning. They recorded harvests, laws, prayers, and songs. They were the memory of the kingdom. And though few could read their symbols, all understood their power. The pharaohs understood something deeper too: that to last forever, they must be more than rulers. They must be myths. And so, stories of their deeds were carved in stone. their names etched in temple walls, their faces shaped into statues that gazed endlessly across the desert. All of this, the temples, the priests, the scribes, the stars, was more than tradition. It was a web, a great shimmering design meant to hold the world together, to keep Ma'at alive. For the Nile gave life, but only the Pharaoh, with the help of the gods and the people, could give it meaning. This was the heart of the early Egyptian world: balance, harmony, eternity. And it all began in the stillness of the river, in the hush of morning before the first prayer, in the quiet offering of a single flower laid gently at the foot of a wooden shrine. Sleep now. Let the gods watch over you. Let the river carry you, and let the past hold you softly in its arms until morning comes again. The Nile kept flowing, and with it, time. Narmer's rule had passed into memory, but the world he shaped began to take form, brick by brick, law by law, stone by sacred stone. His son had inherited more than a crown. He inherited an idea that a king could live forever, and to live forever, one needed a place to return to. Not a simple grave of reeds and clay, but something stronger, something worthy of a god. In the land of the living, the people farmed and fished. They sang songs to the Nile and watched the skies for signs of rain. But in the minds of kings, the focus turned elsewhere, to the west, to the desert, to the land of the dead. It was believed that the sun god Ra traveled there each night, sailing through the underworld in darkness before being reborn at dawn. And so, tombs began to rise along the western edge of the Nile. Simple at first, just deep rectangular pits with wooden beams and mud walls. But slowly, they grew. These tombs were called mastabas, flat-roofed, rectangular, with sloping sides, like the first step towards something more. Inside, the dead were laid to rest with care. The king's body was wrapped in linen and placed in a wooden coffin. Around him, food, wine, oil, weapons, and servants, real and symbolic. Carved ivory tags told the names of those buried nearby. Clay seals marked what was inside each jar. These were not mere burials. They were portals, gateways between worlds. Above ground, the tombs looked modest, but below the surface, they spread outward, chambers and corridors, storage rooms filled with goods for the afterlife. Scribes kept careful lists of what was buried, priests recited spells, and artists painted scenes of paradise, green fields, flowing water, and eternal sunlight. The king was expected to live on, ruling forever in the afterlife. But to do that, his tomb had to be perfect, protected, and remembered. So the tombs grew larger, more complex, more permanent, and for the first time stone was used, not just mud brick, stone, eternal, unchanging, like the gods. In time, the early kings of the first dynasty were buried in Abydos, a sacred city of the dead, far to the south. There, tombs lined up along the desert edge, each one more ambitious than the last. Some kings were even buried with sacrificed servants, A sign of power, yes, but also of belief that in the next life the king would need his court. Though cruel to our eyes, it reflected the strength of the idea. Death was not the end, it was the beginning of something more. As dynasties passed, the tombs became statements, not just of wealth or power, but of connection to the gods. Each king hoped to be remembered as more than a man. He wanted to become divine. And so, temples were built beside the tombs, places for offerings, rituals, prayers. Priests walked the halls in silence, tending to statues, lighting incense, chanting words written by the stars. A sacred order began to form, a priesthood, a royal architect, a vision that would one day lead to the greatest tombs the world would ever see. But the pyramids had not come yet. That dream, that idea, was just beginning to stir. Among the courtiers and builders, a name would soon emerge. Imhotep, a genius of stone, a servant of kings, and perhaps the first true architect in human history. He would serve the pharaoh Djoser, and together they would break the mold. But that story belongs to another part of our journey. For now, we remain in the age just before, where kings were buried in the sand, where the stars were read like prayers, and where the silence of the tomb whispered promises of eternity. Even among ordinary people, death took on new meaning. Tombs became more elaborate. Amulets were placed on the body. Small statues of servants, shabti, were carved to work for the dead in the next world. Spells were recited, protective charms painted. A belief took hold that one's heart would be weighed after death against a feather, the symbol of truth. The concept of ma'at, order, balance, cosmic harmony, guided not only the king, but every farmer, scribe, and potter. To live well was not just for this life, but for the one beyond. The west bank of the Nile became a landscape of memory. Wind howled softly through the dry hills. Vultures circled in the sky. The sun blazed during the day and vanished behind the dunes at night. But beneath the ground, in the cool silence of the tombs, the kings waited. They waited for eternity. And so we rest here, in this quiet chapter of time, before the pyramids, before the great temples of Karnak or Luxor, before the names of Ramses or Tutankhamun. Here, in the earth and sand of Abydos, Saqqara, and Nakada, the first pharaohs sleep. Their tombs still stand, worn and half forgotten, but whispering to those who listen. They tell us of a dream, of stone rising higher, of names carved into forever, of a people who believed that memory was power, and that death was only the door to something greater. Sleep now. Let the river fade into starlight. Let the sand cover your thoughts like a warm blanket. The kings are at rest, and so are we. The sands of time moved slowly. Kings rose and fell, each buried with care beneath the western hills, as the Nile continued its ancient rhythm, rising, falling, feeding life. But then, something shifted. A new king stood beneath the desert sun, with a vision unlike any before him. His name was Djoser, and he would not be buried in the sand. He would rise, not just in name, but in stone. Djoser ruled in the third dynasty, generations after Narmer. By now, the idea of the pharaoh had become more than tradition. It was sacred law. The king was no longer merely chosen by the gods. He was seen as a living god himself, the bridge between earth and sky, between men and eternity. And Djoser wanted a tomb that reflected that truth, something permanent, unchanging, a stairway to the heavens. To build it, he turned to a man whose name would echo through history, Imhotep. Imhotep was not a warrior, nor a king. He was a priest, a scholar, a healer, but above all, he was a builder. He looked at the mastabas of the past, those flat tombs nestled in the earth, and imagined something greater, something layered, lifted, alive with purpose. And so, deep in the desert of Saqqara, he began, stone by stone, layer by layer. He did what no one had done before. He built upward. The result was the Step Pyramid, the first monumental structure in all of Egypt, and perhaps the world. It stood like a staircase, carved from limestone, rising above the desert, like a giant beacon to the gods. Not flat, not hidden, but tall, proud, visible to all. 6 steps, over 60 meters high, a tomb and a temple, and below it, hidden in the earth, lay a labyrinth of corridors, shafts, and chambers, carved with precision, filled with offerings, sealed with care. This was no longer a resting place. It was a declaration: the pharaoh is eternal. Around the pyramid, a full mortuary complex was built. Temples, courtyards, chapels, and storerooms. Massive stone walls enclosed it all, with gates and niches carved to honor the spirits. Priests performed rituals daily, feeding statues, lighting incense, reciting hymns to carry the king's soul through the afterlife. Artisans carved scenes into the stone, Pharaoh Djoser performing rituals, making offerings to the gods, receiving the symbols of life and power. For the first time in history, architecture itself became a form of worship. The people watched in awe. They had never seen anything like it. A building that reached the sky, unmoved by flood or time. They believed it must have been built by gods, or at least through their hands, and in truth, that was the purpose. Djoser's tomb was not just for his body. It was a message to all who saw it. Now and forever, the pharaoh endures. Even in death, he rises. But the pyramid was more than a monument. It marked a shift in how Egyptians saw the world. From this moment on, kings would think in stone, not mud, in centuries, not seasons. The age of ephemeral kings was over. The age of eternal pharaohs had begun. With this new vision came new tools, new workers, and new systems. Stone had to be quarried, transported, shaped. Laborers and craftsmen were organized into teams. Scribes recorded materials. Architects refined measurements. Everything had to be planned and executed with divine precision. It was not forced by whips alone. Many who worked believed they were part of something sacred, something that would last forever, and in many ways, they were right. The step pyramid still stands today, its edges worn by wind, its stones weathered by centuries, but its spirit remains. When you walk near its base, the desert is silent. The sun casts long shadows, and the sky above seems somehow closer, as if the ancient staircase might still carry someone to the heavens. Djoser lies somewhere deep within, wrapped in linen, surrounded by gold and alabaster. His name carved into stone, his face painted in eternal profile. His soul, the Egyptians believed, had flown to the stars to join the undying ones in the night sky. And so, the pyramid became the dream of every king who followed. Bigger, taller, stronger. The fourth dynasty would take it further still, to Giza, to greatness. But none of that could have happened without Djoser and the genius of Imhotep. As you lie back now and the world slows, imagine the step pyramid rising through mist, a light wind brushing your skin, the soft sound of chisels on stone, the scent of burning incense. This is the moment where ambition met belief, where dust became legacy, and where the Pharaoh reached for the stars. Sleep now, and let your thoughts rise like stone, step by step, into the quiet sky of ancient time. The step pyramid rose alone in the sands of Saqqara, the first stairway to eternity. But it would not remain alone. After Djoser, the pharaohs of Egypt began to dream even bigger. Stone would no longer lie flat, it would climb. And Egypt would soon give the world its greatest monuments to the afterlife. One such dreamer was Sneferu, the first pharaoh of Egypt's fourth dynasty. He was a builder at heart. He tried, failed, and learned. At Midam, his pyramid collapsed. At Dashur, his bent pyramid stood at an awkward angle. But finally, he succeeded with the red pyramid, smooth, tall, precise, Egypt's first true pyramid. It marked a turning point. A pharaoh's tomb could now be a mountain of stone, shaped like sunlight itself. Then came Khufu, Sneferu's son, and he dared to go further. On the Giza Plateau, he built the Great Pyramid, one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world. Over 2 million stone blocks, perfectly aligned to the stars, a monument not only to death, but to eternity. Beside him rose the pyramids of Khafre and Menkaure, and the silent stone face of the Great Sphinx, carved from bedrock, watching, waiting. These were more than tombs. They were sacred machines, built to launch the pharaoh's soul into the heavens, built to preserve a name forever. Around them, temples were built, rituals performed. Priests walked stone corridors, lighting incense, whispering prayers to the gods. The pyramid was not only a grave, it was a promise that the pharaoh would rise again with the sun, that his spirit would live on among the stars. But even greatness fades. Over time, the golden age of pyramid building ended. Tombs became hidden, not towering. Wars came, powers shifted, yet the pyramids endured. They still rise above the sands, worn by time, but untouched in spirit. They whisper of a time when men built for forever, and when kings became gods. So rest now. Let the fire crackle softly beside you. Let your breath slow, like the Nile at dusk. Close your eyes and imagine the stars above Giza, the desert wind, the hush of eternity. The pharaohs sleep beneath stone, and the pyramids still dream.